Hey, what's up, viewer? Welcome back to this Nebulous live development creation series. This is day 16, hour 2, and I apologize, I accidentally cut short the last video. I did not mean to. I was gonna finish up that last hour, but I accidentally stopped recording as opposed to unmuted my microphone, so the video wound up getting cut short, like 10 minutes, 13 minutes, something like that. I'm still gonna upload it as hour 1, but my apologies for that. Alright, so in the last video, I was attempting to set up the Nebula spawner to only parent, or to only child the active Nebula stars. If I don't parent them immediately, they like scale to their nebula. So like, I guess the idea I'm getting would be, it's Unity 3D. It's like Unity 3D, stop prefab from scaling when parented, basically. Whoops, I meant Unity 3D. And it looks like because of the upload I'm getting horrendous download apparently. Even though it's getting pretty late, so it's kind of weird. Was my connection gone? No, it's still on. There's probably just a little setting, like spaced out self or something, and then it shouldn't screw up the scaling. And I'm surprised I'm getting lag this hard. Okay, so that's saying to manually change it. I'm not trying to do that. In code. Yeah, see, child transform set parent, and then there's this true value, which might be keep local space or something. So, gee, since this is going so slow, I'm just gonna come in here and take a look. So we could scrap this and basically say new stars at 0 dot transform dot set parent, and is that it, really? It's gonna force me to. I'm going to have to test it out here. So that's gonna force me to go like this. We're gonna have to say, whoops. I have to move the instantiation to the outer part of this. So it equals instantiate this, except for we're not putting a transform on there. We are then saying new star.transform.setParent, and we're simply setting it to, for now, it's just transform, but we don't want it tweaking its size. And then from here we'll add new star. And we don't need to create a brand new game object every time. And actually yank this, because active nebula is handled in a different part of the code. So I'm just going to create a game object to new star. And then we'll come down here and take the type out. Alright. And now we will see if the scaling issue persists or not. And double check my timer's on, okay. Alright, so if this works correctly, the nebulas should not spawn gigantic stars, but the stars should also still be randomly positioned like they're supposed to be. In this instance, there's only one star that actually has them. So we'll take a look at this nebula, zoom in, and there are stars in here. However, these nebula did not, in fact, generate any planets, which is still an issue I'm dealing with here. So because they're all supposed to generate planets. So this time they did, and they are random. However, it's not consistently random. Also, each of these nebula have a nebula stars array, so it's not like I have to instantiate these. Well, I guess hold on. That's actually kind of confusing because, well, if they're instantiated, they have to exist in the game. There's no way around that. However, it is working correctly. So I think if I do this code better, I can fix this. I think there's a way to... There's actually a couple of ways to fix this, but I'm not familiar yet with which one I'm going to use. Okay, so we have them parenting correctly, but now we have the galaxy turning off. Which is kind of not correct. And I only had that code in there to fix some of the transition issues. So I'm going to open these back up, and we are going to not deactivate the self on completion of the transition. Same thing with active nebula, exit the nebula to the galaxy. Same thing, we're going to not deactivate the nebula. And from here, we shouldn't lose any of the objects now. Or, we won't lose the... Yeah, okay, so if I can zoom in, if I zoom in, the star should stay here. Okay, good. And there's even this, like, accidental fade-in value, which is a complete accident. So then if I zoom out... Oh, see, that's a little strange. I, in fact, don't want to select the nebula when I'm viewing it like that. So that's something I'm going to have to change. So I know I can tweak that. Okay, so I'm gonna have to fix that, and I understand why it's happening, but that actually also, yeah, see, the second nebula doesn't have anything in it. That's kind of cool how when I hover over it like that, it actually shows them poking. It shows the stars in there. It's kind of cool. As long as the field of view is far enough, I suppose. And it would be kind of cool to, like, if the player is like zooming out, to quickly be able to click and go back in. So maybe that one. Maybe if I make the zoom faster, it won't matter. Alright, so I've got to fix my random spawn chance code, but if I don't worry about that for now, I basically have some star plots, which are randomized. So, like, this is a random star plot. I need to be able to pan around them. This is the main thing. I've got to fix that selection issue as well. And the first thing that came to mind there was actually using a raycast layer. Might be a good idea. Alright, so for now though, the first issue is that the active nebula object, upon the transition beginning, needs to pass the active, or the actual nebulas, in this scene, this time all three nebulas have no stars. So I'm starting to, I can't imagine what kind of bug that is. I'm not sure how my code is so wrong for making sure a nebula stays, but I have a new idea for how to fix that anyway. But the idea is that nebula clone, so the active selections, okay, so basically, whenever the galaxy is transitioned into, so whenever the galaxy is transitioned into the sorry, I'm brain farting here for a sec. Alright. So okay, so before I null the current active selection, I have to take basically player data current active selection get component I guess it doesn't even have to do that, because we're assuming the nebula has children. So let me see here. Child count. But it's an index, child index anyway. So we can use child count to say and basically do a for loop that is for each child, and this actually will guard against there being no children. We have to basically say player data current active selection transform get child at the index of I, and we have to say set parent to the active nebulous transform, which we can cache up here. Forgot to transform, and simply toss in active nebula transform as the new parent. And I don't really want it scaling, so I'm going to use the nifty little trick we learned to set that to true. Okay, so that's basically just going to re-parent all of the nebula stars to the active star object, which I don't even know if that's necessary or not. It's more for in the editor anyway, so I can see them. The other problem, though, is that's saving every single nebula's star. Alright, let's give it a shot anyway. So we load up an active nebula, should no longer have a group by default, but if we... So I'm actually seeing one issue I must have forgotten to reference somewhere. Active nebula. Oh, and that's because active nebula is deactivated, so I have to say true. I think it's true. Include inactive true. Okay. My bad. I forgot about that. And okay, so the error is gone, and now we have stars in all three nebula, nifty. And if I select this nebula and zoom in, it transferred them . How many are here? 12. 12. So red star, red star, red star, red star, red star, red star, red star. Okay, so yeah, it doesn't look like it worked correctly. feel like that should like because it can't produce different stars. It didn't actually parent these correctly. Look at that. Yeah, it's super weird. And get child is a transform actually. So I can just go like this, right? So again, we're looking at 25 total, so let's take a zoom in here, and once again, it's like just not working. It's still the same 25 I've selected though, so it's for some reason the loop is just not working correctly. Alright, so I guess we have to try debugger then. It's gonna take a second here. Alright, so this says the player data's current child count is 12. Whereas in the game, it's also 12. Okay, so we step into it then. Okay, I think I know what's going on. I need to change the transform backwards, basically. Okay. Yeah, I wouldn't have thought of that in like a million years, to be honest with you. So in fact, what I need to do is, I need to do this backwards and say, child count, I greater than -1, child count -1, I greater than -1, because then we'll go from child count -1 to 0. And now it will pull them off backwards. As long as their positions stay the same, the order doesn't matter. So we're looking at 9 total, and if I zoom in, I'm screwing up something. Oh, and I forgot to say my I minus minus, which in fact is going to screw this up. So, okay, good. So that should be fixed. I just forgot to swap the for loop. So now if we take a look, we have Nebula only in this last one, and it's 9 stars. So if I click on this and zoom in, they all go to the correct spot now. Okay, so now I have to set it up to where... Actually, I need to fix this too, where it's selecting the nebula. But if I zoom out, I have to move them all back, basically. So for that, on exit nebula, let's see, current active selection. I need to transfer the stars back even if there is no active selection. So I'm going to appearance a game object. What, previous active selection, or? To a point, actually, the... So actually, this is probably player data value. Alright, so active nebula has to put all of its children onto the current nebula selection, basically. And in here we have to say So this is for a global clearing of current active selection, just in case like there's a planet selected, more than anything. It then can transfer, or actually what needs to happen basically, I suppose, is that here is where we have to set player data.current nebula selection equals player data.current active selection. So now current nebula selection has an object, and when I exit the nebula, more or less we're doing this same loop here. Oh, and I don't have to do this anymore, I don't think. But more or less we're just doing this one loop again where we're saying it's going to be a little different, but I guess we have game object dot active current active nebula, right? Current nebula selection. Or it's arguable that that's the previous one, so let's just leave it at current, I suppose, but we can basically come in here and say current nebula selection. But that's not correct either. We're just gonna have to say active nebula. Oh, and in fact, we really just want to transform. Alright, and then from here, we say essentially the same thing here. It's basically the same exact thing. So we just say active nebula transform, its child count, and then we're going to go from the bottom up, and we're setting same thing here, active nebula transform. Oh, and we can just say get child. And then we're setting the parent. In fact, the parent is going to be current nebula selection. Dot transform. And all this is going to do is make sure that the objects transfer back and forth properly. And honestly, while I'm making a system like this, my long-term idea is to have the nebulas not actually store their stars like that, but instead just have like an integer value for number of stars, or basically have an integer array. And that integer array like just picks the index of the star, and then anytime that nebula is selected, what happens is active nebula pulls in that array and instantiates each of those instances. And then anytime we leave the nebula, we just delete the active instances in active nebula, but these don't change. So the way I've done it is more high level, but there's a way to do it without storing every single star at once. I can instead just store integers that tell the active nebula object which stars to instantiate, and then it becomes the parent of those stars. And then those stars just get, there could even be a star pool that pulls like 20 stars, and then each nebula just like plugs in its values, and it just like uses the pooled stars to tweak stars that already exist in memory. So if it needs to get more efficient, that is one way it can work. If putting way too many if having way too many stars on spawn is a problem. Honestly, it's kind of a memory hog, but the stars are so small that like the engine already culls them, so they can exist in memory, but they aren't going to slow the rendering down, as far as I can tell. The only thing they can do is like clog the RAM up all the way. Okay, so let's make sure this is working. So if I select this and zoom in, I get those three. Okay, good. And if I zoom out, they should go back to their proper parent, and they do. Okay. And if I zoom on, it doesn't have anything, it doesn't break anything at all. Alright, so I guess that still leaves me with potentially efficiency issues, but I'm not going to worry about it. That functionally then leaves me at the bug where it's not actually giving me a minimum star count like I want properly. And I have the value for that, a manual value. So and I guess I'm going to jank this up to 45. So basically, it should force at least 3 stars in every system pretty consistently. And it just didn't work. Okay, so if I jack it up to like, just put it to 1 then. Because that should force it to, that should force 3 stars to spawn every time that's supposed to work, but I might be messing up my algorithm a little bit. Yeah, so I'm just messing up something because, yeah, I'll just have to rework that. At some point I'm going to have to dive in to fix that. Alright, so the other pressing issue is the fact that the camera needs to be able to be micro-zoomed and panned a little bit, just so the player can have a clearer view of the nebula stars from a tactical top-down kind of perspective. Alright, sorry about that. I spaced out a little bit. Alright, so I don't really feel like tackling the random system right now. I'm going to have to, like, essentially what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to use the triple for loop to convert, or I'm just going to have to break up the for loop. The for loop's going to have to generate a position, or basically like an array of positions, and then in the event minimum star count has not been found, it has to just keep picking until it does, which is already what it's supposed to be doing. So if I go back to this particular script, I am a little confused here because adjusted random nebula star density nebula force star spawn incrementer. Did I actually pick the wrong? Oh no, I picked the correct one. Alright, so sorry, this one's really making me want to think here. Okay, so we're at a random range between 0 and 1. If that random value is greater than the adjusted nebula star density, then it's going to spawn a star. If the random value was not grabbed, or if the random range is lower than the adjusted density, then if new stars dot count, which, hold on. Oh. Oh, am I screwing that up completely? I think I am. I think I'm screwing it up completely. Oh, no, I'm not. What is adjusted random nebula star density instantiating or initializing as random nebula star density? Yeah, I have to admit, I don't know why this isn't working. Like, it's pretty straightforward. If there aren't, the only thing I can imagine off the top of my head is that this count is not updating accurately until maybe after the whole loop is done or something like that. So let me give this a shot here. And it just reminded me of something I need to fix as well. Okay, so now we're looking at, did it give me a value for this, or? So the adjusted random star value thingy is 0.1. New stars that count greater than, or let's see. Yeah, so it's less. So then this should go down to, it'll go down to negative 0.9. Yes, and then the range has to be higher. So like, I mean, that's all straightforward. It's going to run through here, no problem. It'll add one to new stars. Adjusted random nebula density goes down to random nebula star density. Yes, now the new star count is 15. But then it's just going to skip the adjustment. Okay, so like X resolution, I mean, that one basically worked. It's working correctly when it chooses to work. So like my idea is that essentially X resolution is Nebula XRes, Nebula Y XRes, inclusive exclusive. It still should work every time, basically. Because even if this is 4 and 8, or okay, so if Nebula Y is 2 and 4, then worst case scenario is minimum Nebula Y resolution is 2. So it can only be between 2 and 3. But if it is 2, then it's 1-to-1, it's never going to run. But if it's 3, it'll run at least once. So I think the algorithm is correct, but I am using the value incorrectly. So I am going to change the Y resolution up to 3, which is going to force it to 3, which forces it to 1 practically. So I'm going to change it 3 to 5. And then I'm also going to, well, let's take a look. Okay, so now all 3 of them have stuff. And my adjuster value is so high that it's like gonna spit a ton out. So let me change this back to 0.15 like I had it as. And that makes it take 3 or 4 iterations to get the maxes out. So as long as it runs like 12 times, it'll more or less spit out 3 values. And if I take a look again, we're looking at, dang, that was gigantic. And part of that is because this didn't go up a couple tiers here. And then the maximum density dang, I can't believe this one's gigantic. It has 45 stars in it. So I've actually grabbed the second nebula and zoom into it. It's a very dense nebula. And I might actually have to make them much smaller, because these stars are like super close together, all things considered. And the idea is that if I'm like right on the star, or like my planet is, I don't need these stars like right next to it. So it's a little off size-wise in that regard. So in this instance, there are many fewer stars. So I'm actually considering lowering all of the sizes again by like times 10. And the point would be for, like I described, the locality, the star locality is to, it's to the stars are too close together, basically. I also want to lower this now to like something like this. Excuse me. Okay, so now if I force these down. Oh, you know, I just remembered also. So if they're like even bigger now, I think I know what my problem is, which is that my greater than or less than sign is way out of position. So they're better though. It's kind of cool the local fog works zoomed in. It's not as it's harder to tell in the scene view, oops. But the other thing is the density could be higher if and the stars are spaced out further. However, this actually doesn't look too bad like this. And if I come in here and I jack around with some of this like field of view, I can do that. I can narrow the field of view. I can also limit the far clipping plane. I want to fix that problem where it's in the when the active nebula is active, it shouldn't be changing its colors on selection, basically. So maybe a ghastly change to that one script in particular, which was some kind of unhover, change color on hover script. Okay. So this, like the nebula object does not need this activated if they've completed a transition, more or less. The other thing is I could use the raycast layer, so I'm trying to debate which one to actually implement here. If I just turn off this component on that object and turn it back on, I think that would be the best thing to do. That leaves the behavior isolated in that regard. So what do I need to do? I need to grab the, once again we're back into this here. So interselected nebula. So in the event okay, so if the iteration completes, camera is in transition is false is true. We also have to grab oh, that reminds me. I need to clear, or I need to, there's something I need to do with current nebula selection that I forgot. I wonder if I could just turn off that behavior as well. I might have just been able to do that. But basically we say player data dot current nebula selection dot get component, and then it's color on change color on hover dot set active or enabled maybe. Then make sure it's not deprecated. Equals false. And all this is going to do is once we're inside the nebula, it can't act as a hoverable. And to the same extent, we're basically doing the same thing on mouse down. So on mouse down, okay, so this might not have been a terrible choice for an object layer, but I'm not going to do that at the moment. Instead, we need to oh, you know what? And okay, to the same extent, I guess I'll just clean this up too. Whenever we exit the nebula, we are essentially going to do the same thing. And we're just going to say, oh, and actually this one is true. Because once it's exited the nebula, we can in fact hover it. Alright, so then basically all we want to do is say, we basically want to use these two, these true values to say okay, so now I'm debating needing something in particular. So now essentially what I'm trying to do is basically have an enum that defines the tiers and then shift the enum every time I swap tiers. And then more or less, if current tier is nebula tier, remove the nebula itself from being selectable. It is more or less the goal, and that I might be able to make that happen with the collider. So perhaps the nebula gets its collider deactivated when you're inside of it, but I don't think that's going to be a good idea. I think instead I'm just going to have to use the enum and say I might have to mess around with doing layers also. So let's see. Let me take a look here. Alright. Well, that was a good hour, so as you can see, I'm slowly but surely making progress towards having a galaxy that randomly generates nebula positions, randomly generates types, quantities, and positions of stars inside of this nebula. And once I get some better controls for that, where the player can move the camera around a little bit and kind of see the stars, the next step after that is setting it up to where the player can then enter separate star systems. Once that's done, more or less, the player will, the game will start off by generating a random player system somewhere. It'll have to determine that by generating all the positions or something like that. Or it'll have to generate star counts and then pick one randomly to be the player system. Or something. I'm going to figure out something, but it'll randomly pick a player system, and then it will essentially start the player next to their planet. And the idea is that only like their planet and their sun are discovered. And they'll be able to use their scanner to find signatures in their star system. But once they've got their star system set up pretty good, they're going to be able to start scanning into nebula space. And they're going to be able to start discovering other stars. And from there, they'll then be able to translate up into galactic space where they can actually scan to other nebula. So, this is actually a rather pivotal part of it. It's probably the second hardest technological part of the game after ships. Not like single ships, but figuring out how to efficiently do fleets of ships might be harder, and then like some of the AI for the fleet might be a little tough. Besides for that, maybe like faction AI might be a little tough. But I mean, basically, it's faction AI, fleet AI, and generating the star system, or just like generating the galaxy. Those are like basically the three hardest technical parts that have to get covered. And I'm still working on making pretty solid progress towards those. And I've kind of rambled on here for a bit, so I'm going to cut this video for now. I appreciate that you've actually watched up to this point if you have. So take care, and I'll see you in the next video.